Welcome to episode 9 of Educational Assessment with Professor DeNobile. I'm your host, Professor DeNobile, and this episode is Observation of the Learner. So, we're going to do a very deep dive. This may be a little bit longer than some of the other presentations, but it's a very important one to understand the role of observation as a method of assessment. So, our agenda today is to look at the purposes of observation, look at different types of observation, and then looking at the observational system. So, I want to start off with a brief discussion for some of you to think about this as we move forward. Based on your readings and field experience, what do you think the strengths of using observation of assessment? What are some weaknesses of observation? We're going to go more in depth on that in the next few slides. And is it only in early childhood education that we would use observations? I'm not going to answer those questions now. I'm going to come upon that later on because as we move forward, these are going to really answer themselves of the strengths and weaknesses, but also whether or not observation is only used in early childhood education. So, the strengths and weaknesses of observation. So, the strengths of observation include the fact that they're done in an authentic setting. When we're doing observations in the classroom, we're observing students not in a vacuum, we're observing them in their natural setting of learning. That's why observations are very strong. We're seeing students perform tasks as they're performing them. This allows you to observe all domains that you're trying to understand about the student. You can see different learning styles within the classroom. Children don't have to be able to read and write in order for you to observe them. So that is another strength. If you're trying to figure out, do they understand something? Well, they don't necessarily need to read and write for you to figure that out through observation. And the child could be minimally aware that the observation is even happening, especially if the observer is the teacher. Because if the observer is the teacher, the child is already comfortable with you in their setting. And therefore, you could be conducting observations without the students even knowing that you're conducting an observation. Some of the weaknesses, they're not necessarily aligned with specific standards. Um, they can be subjective. We're going to be talking about that, the importance of objectivity when we're doing observations, meaning personal elements may color the observer's perceptions. It takes a lot of time to do observations. It can, unless you've mastered how to do observations. Mental processes can't be observed. I can't sit in front of a kid and look into their mind and see suddenly, oh, that's how they're putting it together. That's one of the problems of observations. They require focused attention. So I may be doing 100 different things, but if I want to observe a particular student, I need to stop what I'm doing and really focus on that student. Um, and it might not provide all the information you may need by itself. And I think by itself is the key word there. Observations are, as with any assessments, as we've said in the last presentation, it's about triangulation. And so teacher observation is valid if it's done correctly. It's a valid form of evidence to help us triangulate along with student performance data, along with test data. Observation is another tool in our toolbox of assessment of how we can assess our students. Ooh, going back here. So this researcher Beatty published in 1997 8 reasons for observing children's development. I'm not going to go through all 8. I'm just going to focus on 3. So the three I'm going to focus on is number 3, to make individual plans on observed needs, to resolve a particular problem involving the child, and to gather information for the child's folder for use and guidance and for placement. So what I want to emphasize here is that observations help us game plan the observed needs of students. I may not understand the behavioral needs of a student based solely on test scores. Test scores don't tell me much in terms of day-to-day existence of a child. So observations allows me into the inner world of the child in order to see what are their needs and how can I help them get to where they should be based off of different standards of child development and things like that. They help resolve a particular problem involving the child. So let's say the parent or the counselor or other teachers have said this particular student is having this particular problem. Again, test scores may not help me really get to understand where this child is at. I may need to sit down and observe this child in a natural setting in order to see, okay, here's the problem that was given to me. What evidence can I gather to support that this problem is actually happening? And then I can go off now and kind of like in number 3, but I can now address this problem directly because I have firm evidence because I personally observed it. And then number 8 is important, to gather information for the child's folder for use and guidance and for placement. So oftentimes, I'm dual certified in special education, and therefore, one of the first and last things you're supposed to do as a special education teacher in any given year is you're supposed to spend the first 2 to 3 weeks observing and the last 2 to 3 weeks observing in order to have evidence to put into the students' IEP reports. Now, that is ideal. What ends up actually happening is you have to find out when the students' IEP reports are due, and you have to schedule your observations around those deadlines. So, unfortunately, what ends up happening is that in a given school year, you may have 20 or so students with disabilities who have IEPs or 504s, and in reality, you're supposed to be budgeting your time all throughout the year to make sure that you're getting those observations in time for those IEP reports. But that kind of answers that first question: is it only for the like elementary school or like early childhood education? And the answer is no. Observations have their place all throughout elementary, middle school, and high school, and possibly even college. And we can talk about that in a second in terms of the fact that like observation is important regardless of uh the age of the students. It's more obvious in the early childhood grades, as we're going to look on the next slide, I believe. Yes, for some of the objectives of observation include, they're specifically for development, physical, cognitive, language, and social emotional development. So it makes a lot of sense that in early childhood education, observation happens a lot, and it's really effective there. But it's also important at the higher levels. Here's an example. If I'm teaching a lesson and I'm with my 11th grade students and they're staring back at me, blank-faced and scared because they have no clue what I'm talking about, and I continue teaching that lesson, I am not using my observation to pivot my instruction in that moment. The observation I see they're blank faced, they're freaking out, they're scared. Clearly, they're not understanding what I'm talking about. So I need to pivot in that moment. If they're doing an independent task, oftentimes what happens, I've done this over the years, I've given an independent task and I really don't survey the room. I really don't look around to see what's going on. And oftentimes, if you don't do that, if you don't survey the room, you'll notice that there are pockets of students who are on task and know what they're doing. And then you'll have a handful of students who are just sitting there doing nothing. And here's why observation has to be objective and not subjective. You can dismiss it. Those are the lazy students. That's why they're doing what they're doing. Maybe it's because they really don't understand the task at hand, and you need to give them a little bit more instruction and work with them one-on-one in order to meet the needs of where they're at in that moment. So again, the whole point of this is simply to say that observation is regardless of grade level. In college, it's the same thing. I've taught a handful of college classes, and I'd be giving a lecture on research, and all of a sudden the students are freaking out, like, what the heck are you talking about? And I need to pivot. And that's what observations allow us to do. They allow us to see development in the setting as it's happening, and you have to make a decision on what you're going to do based off of that evidence. Now, that's an oversimplification because we're going to be looking into different methods now of direct observation, because some observations can be more in depth. And they too can be used at the higher grade levels, although these are most often used at the early childhood levels. So the two major different types of methods include narrative or naturalistic, and empirical or systematic methods of direct observation. The narrative naturalistic methods create what we call qualitative data, and then the empirical systematic ones create quantitative data. The narrative method creates behavioral records in natural setting, in the sequence of occurrence, and they include they're in a written descriptive format. They include anecdotal and running records. Empirical systematic methods are measurements of behavior. They help precisely develop and evaluate interventions, and these include time sampling and event sampling. Different types of factual observations include descriptions of actions, quotations of language, description of gestures, and description of creation. So, for example, as a description of action, Billy sorts the buttons by color. After repiling, Billy sorts the buttons by number of holes. Now, it's really important to see here, and again, I want to emphasize again about objectivity versus subjectivity. The observation does not interpret. It doesn't provide commentary. It doesn't use language that even suggests interpretation or commentary. So, for example, you wouldn't say Billy smartly sorted the buttons by color, or that he, you wouldn't provide certain adjectives and adverbs that seems to lead the observation in the direction that the teacher wants it to be. You don't know why Billy sorted the buttons by color. You don't know why he sorted the buttons by number of holes. You may need to ask. You may do an interview, which is a different form of assessment. But here, this is a factual observation. This is literally what you saw in that moment. Quotations of language. Sally said he gave me the ball. Sally said he gave me the ball. That's the word that Sally used. Gave. He gave me the ball. Description of gestures. Tommy tied his shoes. All right. You don't want to say quickly, slowly. He tied his shoes. If you wanted to add, Tommy tied his shoes, it took him 5 to 10 seconds. That's a descriptive. You're not saying slowly or quickly. You are adding another factual observation, even though that's more of a measurement. But the point is that you're not qualifying the observation with interpretation or commentary. Description of creations. Jill built a maze with her Legos. Straightforward. That's the importance of the factual observations. On the other end, this is beyond our course, but this is important to understand from the other end because typically in education, when we think of observations and we think of formal observations, we think of when administrators observe teachers. Ideally, administrators, when they're observing their teachers, they're providing factual observations and they are not infusing interpretation or commentary, because if they infuse interpretation or commentary in their observations, then what they're doing is they're showing their hand in terms of how they feel about that teacher. This is just as it is important for administrators to be objective in their observations of teachers. It is just as important for teachers to be objective in their observations of students. Again, I can't overemphasize this need for objectivity. Don't let what you know about your students subjectify your observations. Here's what I mean, and I've seen this over the years. You'll have that annoying student. So the annoying student, the student who they're legitimately annoying. I'll leave it at that. They're the legitimately annoying student. And now you're sitting there doing an observation of the legitimately annoying student. And they're doing whatever it is that's annoying in that moment because they are the annoying student. Well, you can't say they're doing an annoying gesture in the observation, or they're doing this because they're annoying. Like, you can't write the observation in that way. You need to take a step back and you need to look exactly at the situation as it is and write down just what you see, just the facts, because you might think that student is annoying, but the reality is the student might not be annoying in an objective sense. They may be annoying because whatever it is that they're doing bothers you, which is a whole nother conversation altogether. However, don't let what you know about the student subjectify your observation of them. You want to be objective in your observations at all times. Different types of observational. This is one of the narrative ones, which is the anecdotal record. They're written descriptions of a child's behavior, what happens, when and where. They're objective accounts of behaviors. Interpretations are recorded separately. So as you can see here, the names of the students have been whited out for this particular example. And then this was on January 5th, 2016. I'm assuming the teacher's name was Taylor. This is page 10 of their journal. The lesson was multiplying 2 and 3 digit numbers. And during the independent practice, it looks like Taylor went around and they were noting that this student needs more practice. They're unsure of the process for 3x2. Doesn't understand the placement of the 0, but these two students mastered the task as they were going through. So as you can see, this is less behavioral and this is more academic. This is more of an anecdotal academic record. Oftentimes we will see anecdotal records for behavior. One of the things that I wasn't doing at the beginning of my career that I wish I did do more often was keep a notebook of anecdotal records day by day, especially if I had interactions with students um, that, let's say I had an argument with a student. It happens. We have disagreements with people all the time. You're going to have disagreements with students. You're going to want to keep an anecdotal record in your notebook um, in order to make note of a situation as they arise. You may never have to address that situation ever again. But what happens if all of a sudden, 2 or 3 weeks later, you're called into the dean's office to talk about that situation that you had with a student 2 weeks ago, and you're sitting there and you're like, I have no clue what you're talking about. You have no anecdotal evidence that that um, incident ever occurred, and then it's like it's you against them. It's your word against their word. And this becomes very important also in terms of student behavior. So, for example, let's say you had to ask a dean to pull a student out of your classroom. Well, you're going to want to write down what actually happened because eventually you're going to have to talk about that with either the assistant principal or with the dean to talk about the incident at hand. And if you don't have your notes of your end, it's not going to look good that you don't know what happened in that situation. So this is why it's important not only to do like formal anecdotal records for um, student achievement, whether it's behaviorally or academically, but also informal anecdotal records for your own benefit. Whether it's reflecting on the daily lesson of how it went, or interactions with students that you need to chronicle and you need to put down on paper just in case for whatever reason that it may come up in a later conversation and you need to know what that event was about. Event sampling is used to determine when a particular behavior is likely to occur. It's typically for inappropriate behaviors. Each occurrence of the target behavior is recorded. On page 131 of the textbook, it talks about the ABC method and what is the problem behavior. I'm just going to double check to make sure that it is indeed page 131 of the textbook because that seems a little late in the textbook. Yeah, it's not 131 of the textbook. I apologize for that. I need to look up to see where the ABC method is because it's not on page 131 of the textbook. Is it page 31 of the textbook? Probably not. Yeah, no, it's not page 31 of the textbook. So I will add a link to say what the ABC method is, but I'm assuming the ABC method, what the ABC method is the anecdotal event or the antecedent event, the behavior, and the consequent event. That's the ABC method. It's right there. What is the problem behavior and what is maintaining it? You will notice that this is anecdotal in nature, but there's more information that's being provided. So that's what event sampling is. We're providing a sampling of events in order to better focus on what it is. In this case, this is for social emotional. It's been observed in the past that Tamika hits other students. So in these two particular events, Tamika hit Rosie at 2:41 p.m. and then at 3:20 she grabbed a book and hit John. We love Rosie. Rosie's one of our best friends when we see this type of behavior because we really want to understand why. So at 2:41, Tamika and Rosie are eating a snack. Rosie takes part of Tamika's cracker. So Tamika hits Rosie. The consequent event, Rosie calls to the teacher. At 3:20, John is looking at a book in the library center. Tamika asks for the book. John refuses. Tamika grabs the book and hits John. John hits back and takes back the book. Tamika gets another book and sits down. So as we see in this event sampling, now here's interpretation and commentary outside of the actual record. What we see here is that Rosie responds inappropriately when she feels that things are being done to her, even if it's legitimate. So, like, Rosie takes part of Tamika's cracker. Rosie should not have done that, but that does not justify Tamika hitting Rosie. When Tamika hits Rosie, Rosie calls the teacher, and who gets in trouble? Tamika. Tamika gets in trouble because she hit her, even though Rosie was the one who stole a piece of Tamika's cracker. Tamika asks John for the book. John refuses the book, or John refuses to give Tamika the book, and so it looks like that Tamika interprets this to mean that John is slighting her, and therefore she hits him with the book. So John hits back, and then Tamika finds another book and sits down. So it has nothing to do with the book itself. It really looks like, based off of this event sampling, that Tamika does not know how to process when things aren't going her way, even if it's legitimate, like Rosie taking the cracker from her, or if it's not legitimate, where John refuses to give her the book, which John doesn't have to give her the book. But the point is that she responds inappropriately with hitting. Now that we see this and we see these different observations next to each other, we can now talk about possible next steps. It should be noted that Tamika is 4 years old, so that she's in pre-K kindergarten, around there, and so maybe her inappropriate behavior has to do with the fact that because of her age. It could be something to do at home. Maybe something's going on at home. But the point is that we can't make any decision whatsoever unless we observe the actions in their natural environment, without providing commentary, without providing interpretation as part of those observations. Why use anecdotal record and event sampling? Mostly for behavior modification, and also as evidence when speaking with parents, counselors, and administrators. If I have to call home because of a student, because I wrote them up, maybe I wrote them up because I told them, like, I maybe gave them a strike or 2 strikes before, and I told them, if you do that again, I'm going to have to write you up and call home. So now I call home, and whatever the behavior might have been, whether let's say it's cell phone usage. Let's just use that example. It's cell phone usage, school policies that students can't use the cell phone, and I see the student, I gave them 2 strikes, and I told them, next time I see your cell phone, I'm gonna have to write you up, and I'm gonna have to call home. So if I'm calling home for cell phone usage, on its face, it may not seem like, why are you calling home because of cell phone usage? But if I call home and I tell the parents, this week I've had multiple conversations with your child. I spoke with them on Monday. I spoke with them on Wednesday. It's now Thursday. And this is the 3rd time this week that they've taken their cell phone out in class. I'm asking, can you speak to your child about the cell phone usage? Because it's school policy that they're not supposed to be using the cell phone. Now, if I'm going to have that conversation with the parent, I want to be able to know right off the bat, these are the days that I spoke with your child about their cell phone usage. It's against school policy. It doesn't matter how the parents feel about the school policy. I'm letting the parent know these are my anecdotal record observations of this behavior, which the school says they shouldn't be doing. Maybe there's something I need to go to the counselor for, and the counselor's like, well, can you be more specific? That's a typical question of counselor. Can you be more specific with that? And you're saying, I observed the student on this day, this day, this day, and this day. Here it is in my anecdotal record that they were doing this. I really, I think something is up, and I think you should talk to the student. Or I may want to suggest that the student may need evaluation for special education. Well, first off, that needs parental consent in order for that to happen. However, what I, as the teacher, can provide is, here's some anecdotal evidence of what I've been seeing in the class. And now we're going to meet with the parents and saying, I've been seeing X, Y, and Z. You may talk with other teachers and they may say, yeah, we've been noticing that as well. And then the parent can make an informed decision of whether or not they want their child to be evaluated for special services. So those are just other ways. Typically, it's for behavioral modification, but those are other reasons why we may use anecdotal or event sampling. Time sampling involves recording the frequency of a behavior for a given time period. Parameters include frequency, which is the number of times of behavior occurrences, duration, how long that behavior episode lasted. Latency is the time between the trigger and the behavior. Intensity, the strength of the behavior, and the rate, the number of behavior occurrences within a specific time period. So it's similar to event sampling in the sense of the type of information that you're getting, but there's more numerical value here. There's more quantitative values here that we're recording on top of that anecdotal piece of it. There's also a running record. Running record is more detailed than an anecdotal record. It includes sequence of events over time, the attempt to record everything that happens during a given time period. I'll make sure that I update that spelling there for given time period. Interpretations and comments, as always, are recorded separately. So here's an example of a running record. Typically when I think of a running record, I think of reading fluency. Here's a running record of the student is going to read this passage about a baby chick growing, and the teacher is making note all over here about the accuracy, self-correction of the student reading, and this is over time. Over time, is the student making progress? And this running record, let's say for reading, a reading running record, you may have this first grade, second grade, third grade, fourth grade, fifth grade, sixth grade. Oh, it's also typical in middle school, not used as often at the high school level, unless we're dealing with students with disabilities. Sometimes in some of their services, their speech therapist may do a running record in that case. And the point of this is to show the behavior. In this case, it's reading. It could be any behavior for social emotional behavior, academic behavior that we want to keep a record of over time, and we want to have these numerical understanding. What's the frequency and things of that nature. All right, this brings us to the quiz that you're going to be doing for this particular module. You're going to choose a method. You're going to observe the child, and you're going to master the task. You don't worry, I'm not asking you to go and find a random child to observe. There's videos part of the quiz. Um, you're going to choose the method based off of what the task is asking you to do. So, kind of like a real world, an authentic assessment. Uh, you have all of these in your toolbox that you can choose from. Some are more appropriate than others, but you're free to choose the one that you think that it is, and then you're going to go and do it. You're going to go and observe the child and then provide the documentation for the quiz as it says on Canvas. Our summary: there are strengths and weaknesses to using observation as an assessment method. As teachers, our focus for using observation should be to address the individual needs of particular students, such as solving a particular problem for a particular child, and to gather information for guidance and student placement. Just like in scientific studies, different observational methods yield different types of data, including qualitative and quantitative. Qualitative are narrative, quantitative are numerical. Objectivity is important. Don't skew observations or interpretations based solely on your personal experiences with a particular child. Observations help inform how we can best serve our students, and observations are another example of how assessment drives instruction. Thank you. With that, enjoy your spring break next week. And I'll see you on the other side. Talk to you soon.